Well, thank you for that, Rayet, and thanks for inviting me, and also Samantha Rubinson. And also welcome Steve and Betty and people who's worked with me in the past. And there might be some other people that I haven't seen their names. But today I'm going to talk more widely than just graffiti. Graffiti is part of the management and conservation process, but it's better, basically the point that I'm going to make, it's better to be preventative and in the long run probably cheaper to prevent graffiti from happening than to actually removing graffiti. Because even though we know that graffiti begets graffiti, there are places that sometimes have no graffiti, and because of lackluster management practices, sites are graffitied, even the ones that people try to close down. So basically, management of rock art sites is a very hands-on approach where you've got to do constant monitoring and make changes where necessary. This first photograph here is of the Tommy Tucker Caves near Susanville in northeastern California. You can see the Honey Lake there in the background. It is Great Basin territory, and then Mount Lassen, the snow-capped thing there on the eastern horizon. And it shows you that, you can go into these caves and shelters with rock art on the walls there, sometimes against the ceiling, sometimes deeper in, and then archaeological deposits. That is one thing in terms of management, but then one's also got to look at the wider scale, the landscape, the communities close by, the Native American groups that are still in the area, tourist things, agency, context, all of those things. So it's a far larger picture. And because, if you have to consider all things together, it's rather chaotic, but one's got to be selective and make sure that you don't miss the things that are hidden in plain sight. And today I'll just kind of go over some of these things, and but with a caveat that we always likely to miss something, but we try and nail down what we consider is relevant for condition assessment, for interpretation, presentation, and so on. This is from an advert in South Africa that kind of reminds me of misconceptions about rock art. It's an advert for coffee creamer, where the coffee creamer, as you know, should be dry, stored outside. This guy is in a rush. He wants his evening coffee, and he looks inside inside the fridge for the coffee, which is really designed more for the liquid products. And his wife says, it's not inside, it's on top. So he looks on top. Now, for rock art, it's the reverse, where if you add things dry, it really doesn't make that much of a difference. Instead of applying pigment dry, they do mix things like ochre with water, sometimes with a binding medium like blood or plant juices or egg yolk. And that allows the pigment then in its liquid form to sink into between the pores of the sandstone, or in terms of your igneous rock, between the interstices that you find between the grains, the little gaps. And so in effect, the little rootlets then of these pigment, as you can see here on a cross section micrograph of this surface, with the surface out there and then the rock in here, you find the red pigment as part of the rock being sort of anchored. You can see the little red blot there, and on the photos down here, how the red anchors. But if you do it dry, it sits on the surface and it washes off far quicker. So most of the stuff we see today have been mixed with liquid and with water, and that allows the things to go in. But in addition to that, you get layers forming on top of it. So you're not only getting the pigment being anchored in the rock, but you also get redeposition of silica and other types of salts coming in and creating a surface layer that then helps to protect it from weathering and erosion. Weathering being the internal sort of collapse or weakening of the rock, and erosion is where things like water and wind washes the weak rock away. And here is a cross-section scanning electron microscope photograph of pecked surface, and you see the different layers that has developed since the pecking occurred. The red is dry areas where there's dusty and stuff, and the wet is where there's more humidity and more high rainfall. So by looking at these layers, and if there's enough carbon in it, you can date the wet and dry. So like archaeological sites, rock art sites, because they're part of the rock, because they're not on the rock, which is the reverse of the coffee creamer, but they in the above the fridge or outside the fridge. They're inside the rock, or better perhaps sort of betwixt and between, because sometimes you'll get little remnants of paint sticking out on the surface, so it's neither in or out. But also for to make proper petroglyphs, where you peck the surface or we engrave or incise the surface, it does help to add water, and the water acts as an abrasive slurry. So as soon as the little particles, the dust particles from the rock, if you wet them, they will stick to the blade of whatever you're using to cut into the rock, or the stone point that what you use to peck into the rock, and so speed up the process quite considerably. So even in your driest areas where you see deep petroglyphs or pictographs where they use wet pigment, you know that they must have taken some water along. And as I said, you know, here's a cross section of a petroglyph that's been refilled and with a covering. So I mentioned the process, the graffiti removing being part of a wider process, and you could see, you could start off with a baseline recording, and then you go on to condition assessment, which is also kind of part of the recording, but you look more at the rock, and then the significance assessment as you see what the significance is among the Native Americans, among local stakeholders, the tourist industry, archaeologists, agencies, and so on. And then the management would sort of dovetail with that, because what are the concerns of all these people? What do they deem significant? What should be, what are the opportunities to open up a place, or what are the constraints to open or close a place? And then you weigh all of that up, and then filter through the management principles, which is you want to be minimal. You don't want to make too many changes. You want to make it repeatable, so that you don't install something or build a building around something that's going to ruin the whole situation, where you can't repeat anything. It's got to be compatible material, so you don't want to use things like cement against the rock that produces salts. And then also distinguishable. You want to make something that, if you build a wall, that it's not going to be confused with some pre-contact wall. And then the conservation strategies, also following those principles, but you do the testing, and also the maintenance, the visitor strategies, the same management principles, but you focus on interpretation, presentation, and then also, monitoring and see, how the visitor strategies are working. And then your marketing strategies, you can have active ones, you can have passive ones, and then you can have decoy ones where you move attention away from the rock art sites. And then recommendations, depends a lot on visiting the site, monitoring site stewards, seeing, how a site is doing after some changes has been made, or just as a status quo. You might reassess, and then you might want to modify. So there's a feedback sometimes, because sometimes circumstances change, sites become more available, accessible to all-terrain vehicles, or because of drought or excessive rainfall, something happened, or grazing of the land. So let's start with the recording. Recording very often, because, as I said, layers form on top of the pigment, and sometimes the pigment also soaks in. So it appears faint, like this red here on a site in northeastern Alabama. And you find that you can easily walk by it, but then with D-stretch, which is a good prospecting tool, a surveying tool, you find that stuff pop out like this, and then you can go a step further and you can trace that, and under magnification, and you can see then what the figure looks like. You can see in this case 2 little ears going there, and funny looking hands, kind of resembling maybe canine faces with the beak there and the ears, but you know, that's open to interpretation. But it shows you that sometimes you can walk by a site, like many archaeologists, we're not trained in rock art detection. They think a rock art surface, and I've done it myself too. But today, thank heavens, we've got de-stretch on our iPhones and in the Androids, and we can take photographs and then enhance them in the field. Sometimes these things can be quite high up against the cliff face there, like at this is at Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. There's also some of the dark, deep zone caves in Tennessee and in Alabama. You find that some of the Cherokee syllabary is against the ceiling, and still we don't know how people got up there. It must have been with scaffolding. The Indians claim that, you know, people in those days, the medicine people could fly, that's why they could do it. But certain times of the day, for instance, this one that's blocked in red, you cannot see. So they interpretive plaques at the bottom saying that advertise these things, and people sometimes don't believe it, because even when I know it's there, I cannot pinpoint it, because at some stages of the day it becomes invisible. So when people know that if a site is open to public, maybe they should say best visitation hours, say maybe for argument's sake early in the morning, late in the afternoon, sometimes could be midday, and you know, to prevent disappointment. Yeah, you could see the close-up of the that one that's high up in the cliff face, which I think one could have only have done by having a scaffold built, and that they had scaffold at Chaco, as you know, to have built the great houses. And sometimes the rock art just disappear because of colluvial deposit. Here you can see Judicula rock in western North Carolina in the mountains there from 1920s to the 2007, how it's almost half its size. So we had to carefully re-excavate it after consulting with the Cherokees. They're the eastern band of the Cherokee Indians, and it's now in full sight again. And then sometimes you've got natural features that it's not so obvious, but if you look closer by and spend a bit of time recording, see that how they integrated natural features. Like you can see this horn figure here, the lower part of its torso has gone. There's no signs that there's been a recent breakage there, and very often things abut with cracks and breaks in the rock. And then both hands are in a salt flow that comes from higher up a calcite flow. This figure here too, you can see its fingers there. There's a flow from the top, sorry. And then there's another one on the other hand, there's a flow there. So its hands at the same site at Painted Rock in the Carrizo Plain is the same. And you could see this person here too, the hands and the feet. So that could be a thing where these things are, you know, linking into the power of the rock. I don't want to go too much detail because it'll take forever, but the natural surfaces are used. It's useful to incorporate them, both for condition assessment and for interpretive purposes. Then, as I said, you know, it helps to look at these things in a wider landscape scale, like these sites that you can see in red on BLM land in South Central California. And then these sites, as you see them from a distance, and then you come increasingly closer, you can see the ones here on the right, get a closer view, you can get a view of the drainage. And if, you know, if there's problems in the future, you can maybe, by looking at these photographs, try and reconstruct what the problems are. Then you get even closer to the site level. This site here has got a lot of, I think of this Chumash and Tubalabal site here that little extended families live in these areas, black midden with potsherds and obsidian blades, and there's also a burial, I believe, here that, you know, one's got to be very careful about. And then if you zoom in even further, you get the pictographs, very faint against this granite surface, and you can see it goes quite close to the ground surface there. So it doesn't go much deeper underground. So it shows you that sometimes people painting these things took uncomfortable positions. And then without the rock, this is what you see. And then when you look at the superpositioning, you can see that they've done some of the figures first at the bottom layer. This you've got to observe in 3D with your actual eyes. This won't come out with de-stretch. You've got to actually see the edges, that the one stands proud over the other, and to see the superpositioning sequence. And then you get in the middle this line here, and you probably, if you know the stuff in Nevada, the White River Narrows, Stephen Roet, there's similar things that are engraved, but yeah, it's just painted. So these people probably had some sort of contact, then some figures and things right at the top. And that helps one to get a sequence. You look for exceptions. If figures are always at the bottom and they're done in a specific style, you can start developing a chronology and so on. And then you can also sort of kind of classify things from different sites and kind of get a similarity index, you know, the hollow heads over here, the ones with head appendages and small heads and so on, where you see some sort of a trends, circular stuff and so on. And then in the end, see how they relate to each other and where they occur. And then it helps to have sort of a bird's eye view, a map that one can make, you know, either with a drone or just with a tape measure, with the BRMs, the bedrock mortars, slicks where they kind of process foods, the ceramic sherds, and then the firecracked rock and the dark gray midden, all these things that are associated with the site. And then it helps, like Judicula Rock in northwestern North Carolina, the Blue Ridge Mountains there, it helps to have drone photos. And if the light is right, you can see all the features on it. And that is Judicula's hand, 7-digited clawed handprint that he's the master of game. And you've got to, when the Cherokees come to this rock, they've got to stop here before they go into his domain in the mountains beyond, because when they want to, in the old days, when they wanted to hunt things like white-tailed deer, they had to ask him, because they believed he kept it in a townhouse at the bottom of this, at the top of the mountain range. And this boulder, petroglyph boulders like this, are on the way on top there, on the way to the top. So they're kind of like gateways that you've got to stop and pay homage to the master of game. And then you could see the older petroglyph, or rather the soapstone bowl extraction scars there. There's more than simply the imagery at these places. Very often, or I would say in about 95% of the cases, it's about the place, that the place is significant, and then the indigenous people, whoever pre-contact Europeans, they'll go and do stuff there. They go and decorate it. Sometimes you get surfaces that are in perfect condition, they've got nothing on it. So people like Steve Waller, over there from California, San Diego, he's been studying the echoes, that these places have got special echo properties. And yes, Steve Dudrow, whom you all know well, he was helping Steve Waller out on, there are a lot of Steves in this game, it seems, that to study the echoes. And one of the things that Steve found is that in the White River Narrows, north of Alamo, you find that in Nevada, of course, not the Alamo in Texas, you find that the echoes from the rock surfaces where there are pictographs or petroglyphs aren't necessarily more than the echoes from plain sites. But what Steve did find is that you can really hear from one site to another site, you can hear the echo. So if you stand, say, a kilometer from a site around the corner in the White River Narrows, because it's like a long canyon, you can hear people there shouting, or maybe when they were doing the engraving and the pecking, you could hear the percussion around the corner. And you could see here some tests that they did in the open flats, and how rapidly sound drops off, and then in the canyon, how delayed sounds and echoes are. And so these places are significant also for their sound properties. Sometimes, as I showed you in the first photograph, the vistas that they have to powerful places like Mount Lassen on the horizon, you get that often where people go on vision quest and they've got to be able to see some important point in the distance, not always. And I suspect, you know, looking at the ethnography that was gathered by Stoffel and others from Southern Paiute, that a lot of these places in the White River Narrows and in southern Nevada were close to where water babies would have been, where water comes close to the surface. So that could be significant. And then also the plants have grown areas of sometimes of medicinal use and so on. So there's a lot of other things that I think sometimes we miss that are there. So it's not only just because of the rock art, the pictographs, the petroglyphs, but it's also the association like Judicula Rock. And I know some places near San Diego where the indigenous people, the Native Americans who are descendant of those communities who did the imagery, they're more sometimes concerned about the plants and people's behavior and so on than they are with the integrity of the survival of the petroglyphs or the pictographs. They see these things sometimes as disappearing. And sometimes they don't want even graffiti to be removed, but there's always conversation that can be taken. And if everybody agrees that it's better to remove the graffiti, then that's the way to go. But if they think that is part of the process, and they recognize the problems involved, the potential for more graffiti, then perhaps it's better to leave the graffiti alone. So the next thing to do is graffiti condition assessment. I'm not going to linger too much here, but I've got standard lists where we can look at the condition, and then at the end you have generate or you fill in an Excel spreadsheet list, where you can then identify where the things are in conjunction with maps and so on, where the main problems are and what can be done in concert with the management context and also with indigenous concerns. And here is just kind of a photograph of a shelter in the Carrizo Plain, the national monument there for the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management in that part of the world. Inland from Los Angeles, northwest of Los Angeles, on the Carrizo Plain there, and close to the city of, or the town of Barstow, and also, not Barstow, sorry, Bakersfield and Taft. And there is a crack here that could be, shows instability because you also get a crack there, and with gravity pulling down, and the roots growing through, this thing can collapse. So it's advisable that people don't visit this place. There already you can see a fallen boulder. So sometimes places should be closed down because they are danger to the visiting public, unless you put some sort of a thing in there to support, a wooden support to prevent that from falling down. Then you see bad droppings. I've just read a paper where they say bad droppings in the caves in France can be very erosive, and their caves, and even recent graffiti has gone, and also bear claw marks that go back to the Ice Age as a result of new bat colonies and their droppings. So that's something to consider too. Just to show how things can change, this photograph of Painted Rock was taken in 1870. You could see all this Chumash stuff here, really nice. You could see a salt flow there, but you could see all the imagery, just an incredible panel that started off with a wash of charcoal, and then all the images that they did in red and yellow and white on top of it. And it got a really old date, I think, from a similar site. That dates back to 3,000 or so years ago. But yeah, you see it, what it looks like today, where the salt has flowed over it. And also created a loose, the case hardened crust, because of the salt crystals behind. The case hardened crust became loose, and people came and they picnicked here before the 1920s. This was an open place, no conservation management measures, nothing. There were a lot of farmers in the area, and they pried the loose stuff off and they took them home. And so just catastrophic damage. You could see in the background there too. Where there's still pigment on the wall, it's really good condition. You could still see the brush strokes, you could see the skin and stuff, but the silica skin covering it. But otherwise, they really incurred a lot of damage. And it starts off, if you look further away from, there's a bedding plane up there, and the water came through some salts that's not compatible with stuff lower down. And that's where you get the damage. And the close up of it, you could see how the layers come off with the gypsum. And gypsum is one of those salts that it swells when it gets wet, and then when it gets dry, it shrinks. And it's more pressure than one would imagine on the crust, and it pops it off. So one's got to be on lookout for those things. Then the significance. What are the significance for the different stakeholders? Here's an example at Lake Powell on the Arizona-Utah border, where there's an engineer on the left here, and his interest is in old Spanish engravings, but also Indian petroglyphs and so on in the area that you get still preserved on the lake shore there at Lake Powell. This is Charlie Bullock. He's a Southern Paiute, and he's concerned with, what the spiritual integrity of these places. He ascribes a lot of their significance to being water babies and that they should be respected. And this is the boat operator, and he's also tasked of the National Park Service to take tourists around, visitors and so on, and show them, be an interpreter. This is one of the archaeologists who's more into the compliance and administration and the preservation of these things. This guy here, he runs the Graffiti Buster outfit there at Lake Powell, and they're more concerned, going around on these pontoon boats and then removing the graffiti and kind of make, the place, try and make it look again before the graffiti was applied. This is yours truly, who's, looks at things more from an archaeological and conservation point of view. And here is the other archaeologist who was in charge of the National Park Service there at the time, and, tasked to look after things properly. So I mentioned indigenous significance. Obviously, I think, Native American Indians, because this is their heritage, and some of the sites are still very significant to them, that, they should be consulted, just as we would consult people who ancestors, being homesteaders in a particular area, or, who's been buried. It also behooves, I think, the agency and people to consult with the traditional owners. This is a Cherokee elder at Judicula Rock, and he could still know a lot about the rock, and so much so that he still thinks of it spiritually so potent that he doesn't want to touch it. So he's got the stick, and sometimes they use these river canes, river reeds, to point at the rocks, because the rock is believed to have so much power. So it's important to consult with these people. You can also learn a lot. They might not always share everything they've got. And there's also different levels of knowledge. I mean, there's the everyday people who see it as spiritually significant. Others see more tie with the past. It's more than just heritage. And then there are others that really have the old esoteric traditions, maybe not all of it, that I want to share about these rocks and things. And then there's also interaction through the years. Long after these things are done, people will still go to Judicula Rock to mix medicines, to run water over it, collect the water because they believe there's medicine in it. And also here at Painted Bluff in northeastern Alabama, at this Mississippian era site that's about 800 years old. And you can see they rubbed the paint here. If you look through a microscope, you can see it's all kind of it's got an extra sort of calcium oxalate on it from the sweat and the rubbing from the human skin. And so sometimes they wanted to get partake of the power, the potency in the rock. And this is at Painted Rock in Painted Rock in the Carrizo Plain that I've shown you pictures beforehand, where I said the things flaked off. Now there's a photograph that was taken in 1967, and it shows a flake with no pigment. And then when I took a photo again in 1991, when we went with a Getty to remove graffiti there, somebody came with traditional pigment and tried to kind of reconstruct it. And you get a lot of other little areas where you could see there were these attempts at a renovation. You get a lot of gift things left at the site. And also more signs of interaction. This is at Writing on Stone. And these two replicas of cars that they drove to the site with. It was an American millionaire and an Indian elder, a Plains Indian called, I think his name was Rattle something. And but anyway, they came to visit this writing on stone, which is in southern Alberta and Canada, just across the border. I think the border was still open and more open in those days. So the American came with this Plains Indian who lived on the Blackfoot Reservation. And after their visit, because this place is spiritually very significant among the Plains Indians, before the departure, and after going for a vision quest on top of the butte, the guy, the bird rattler, I think his name is, he incised these cars to ensure a safe journey back to wherever they came from in the States. And in the old days, before they went on raids and stuff, they also incised things on the rock to ensure success. And then later on, people might come and undo some of the incisions. And they believe that if you mess in a way, especially if you're a medicine person, you can undo past events. So for instance, if there's a depiction of Custer, you know, with his last stand, if you kind of mess with a depiction of that, you can actually reverse events where the Custer wasn't annihilated. So it's a kind of a different conception of time. I know of Plains Indians that when they visit these places, they won't get out of the bus because they're scared if they go and view these places, they might see bad future events happening for them. And these people, the places are incredibly powerful. And there is, every now and then, I think there might be a medicine person that come and initial it and so on. And this is the overlook of the site they're writing on stone. Those are the Sweetgrass Hills in northern Montana. That's on the American side of the line. The boundary runs at top of the coulee there of the eroded area. And this is where they believe the spirit beings lived, and this is where they come and converse with them, this lodge, before they go and embark on raids or do their incisions, or sometimes when they also went and before making a marriage proposal, that's where they went, or hunting expeditions. They wanted help from the spirit world to help them. And back to painted rock, how do you deal sometimes, especially with raptors, with the wildlife there? Here you see a barn owl in one of these enclaves there, and overlooking the rock art. You see the droppings here. And I mentioned the bat droppings, but here you get of the raptors and also the owl pellets that they drop on rock art panels down below. And consulting with the Yokuts Indians and also with the Chumash, they thought that it's better to leave the birds alone because, you know, the birds, I guess they, going partly in the rock, they kind of converse maybe with the spirit beings there that they believe are still in the rock. And that when you see red pigment and so on the rock surface, they are representatives of the medicine people who did it. So yeah, the wildlife, and especially the raptors, are best left alone. And I've seen it here in the southeast too. If there are hawks and eagles and things flying overhead, turkey buzzards, you know, you leave them alone. They don't want anything, you know, to harm the birds. And but at the same time, there's also research interest that some of the Native Americans are interested in, like this site in the North Carolina, Tennessee boundary, where we took samples to see how old it was with the permission of the Cherokees, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians who live in the Western North Carolina. And we took some samples of the pigment that showed that the red that you see here, the number 2 there, that we also got a date from, is quite a different chemistry from the yellow, number 3 down there. And the yellow, the red has got far more iron in it, and then the yellow has got far more sulfur and calcium in it. You can see the sulfur peak. So that sulfur probably comes from about 5 miles upstream. There's a hot spring, and you often get these things associated with hot springs. And they did the yellow pigment a little bit after they applied the red, because you could see splatterings of yellow on top of the red. So also this dated to as one of the earliest known directly dated rock art things in the southeast, to around about 3,500 years ago that this was done on the cliff face there, and simply because it's so high up out of the reach of vandals, and also because it receives sun the whole day, it's sort of baked in there. And then you get more recent stuff like this at Lookout Mountain in western Texas, at a place called Big Spring, where in the early the early 21st century, you find that, or the early 20th century, sorry, you find that people incise their names, like Leonard Fisher. You see a picture there of him incising his name. It's kind of rare that you get a photograph of a guy doing his name. And you can see the script is quite nice. And in this case, the people who still live in the town, descendants of these people, they've got sentimental value for these names. They still sometimes go up there, they visit, and they see the names of their ancestors there, and they wanted to be left alone. But because this is a state park, people have come there and inscribed their own names, people not from the area, and sometimes it obscures the older stuff, and those things are better not to could not occur or to be taken out. Now, just to look at the management of things, you can sometimes trace the management history of a place by looking at the graffiti. For instance, as I said, at Scenic Mountain at Big Spring, if you look at the graffiti dates versus what happened at that place at that stage, you could see with the Texas Pacific Railroad, when it came through town in 1881, graffiti appeared, but it was sort of not very much, it was kind of, interdispersed. It was not very intense. But then as soon as Pritchard and Edwards, they bought this property, and their friends visited on Sundays and stuff in the early 1900s, you see our graffiti increase. And then when Edwards got sole proprietorship of the property, you find that it increases. But meanwhile, population also increased. But then the state park took over, and you could see it dropped because they kind of had an eye on things, and they stopped people from doing it. And when the state park became fully fledged, you could see also a drop, but then it rose again, after the 1940s. So visitation number and population size and the incidence of graffiti is not necessarily correlated. What also plays a role is how a place is managed. It also had a bit of a spike because there was some CCC troopers that in the 30s came, and they did some nice graffiti, which should also be preserved, because it's kind of a horizon across America of people who did some good stuff. And you can also look at the monthly application by month, and you see that July, because what is the case there where you currently are, summer months, very hot, so maybe on the 4th of July, some visitation, but it drops off. And November, December, the cooler months, it takes over, so the visitation. So you can learn even from graffiti, which is a problem. You can learn some stuff about visitation and so on. Then the management principles, as I said, it's like graffiti removal. If you don't need to do anything, you don't do it. The less you do, the better. If you don't have to remove graffiti, don't do it. If you don't have to put boardwalks or fences or anything in, don't do it. But as preventative stuff, it helps. Here's the boardwalk at Judaculla Rock in 2011 when it was open for the Cherokees. And you can see here people from the Eastern Band, and I think some folks also from Oklahoma came over. And the boardwalk we did after, careful recording. And also there are these interpretive panels on the boardwalk where people then can look at the imagery and learn more about Cherokee practices and their archaeology, and things are done both in English and in Cherokee syllabary. But irrespective of that, or sadly somebody came and when all of that textbook stuff was going on, did this graffiti over here. And so I was tasked to remove it, and this is after removal. It took 2 seasons because we had to monitor to see how things are doing. But to prevent that from happening again, they've got signage up there that say, please do not climb on the rock, but apparently people still do that. And also they've installed motion detection cameras now. But yeah, to prevent that I think they should put a fence, just a ordinary barbed wire, not a barbed wire fence, but just an ordinary fence, chicken mesh or whatever, at the bottom here, and so that just to discourage people, because that's where they go underneath to climb on the rock. So an extra bit of discouragement will help a lot. And as I said, you know, mounting in the trees or somewhere where people cannot see, motion detection cameras, so people know who the perpetrators are. Since the removal there, I don't think there's been a reoccurrence because of, you know, the motion detection camera, and I hope they've put in the fence there. And the conservation strategies, graffiti removal, the topic I was going to talk about initially, but I changed the subject because, as I said in the beginning, preventative measures are preferable to graffiti removal and reintegration, because you know, whatever you do at a site, you have an impact, and graffiti removal is an impact. If you don't have to do it, don't do it. But sometimes it becomes necessary for a variety of reasons. It begets more graffiti, it obscures the art, and also sometimes it causes damage if you leave it too long. You know, it can lead to accelerated erosion, salt formation, various other things. So we try and use minimal techniques, like this person here is using a toothbrush, a nylon toothbrush. That person there is using a dental steel pick. And then these folks down there, you know, using some other techniques. And also you'll recognize Mark Boat right here at the site there at Red Rock Canyon, doing the trade tool of conservatism. That's the rolling poultice with a dowel or a chopstick and a cotton wool bound around the tip. So you've got a giant QT, and then you dip it into solvents and see which solvent takes off, dissolves the pigment the best. And in this case, I think this stuff works. TSW worked very well, and it is basically the trademark for potassium hydroxide. It is pH neutral and biodegradable, so it was good stuff to use. And when we do use that, we try and flush the chemicals out of the rock, and we also use towels for that, so that as little as possible of the stuff remain behind. And you'll probably recognize this exercise. Some of you partook in it. There's Samantha Rubinson peering over the edge. And here we had some sticky dust that we could easily have removed with dry techniques, which is preferable. But because some of this dust was sticky, we took some towels, paper towels, and we put some compatible water on it from the park, which, you know, is probably the same salt and stuff content as the rock. And so we wait for it to dry, and with it drying, the salts are taken up in the towel. And we managed to get the dirt of this one quite effectively, I recall. In the back there was Rahet, and she was doing some camouflaging where you match the pigment, which I'll come back to in the slide after this one. Abrasive techniques, ordinary brushing with steel brushes. Also, you can use corundum, which is inert material. It's very hard. It's aluminum oxide, the particles with air pressure to blast stuff away. Here's the guy that helped me. He was also the boatman to get to the Painted Bluff in Alabama, and he's using a pash thing to nozzle to remove some of the graffiti there. He's also a qualified graffiti guy, tattoo guy. So he did some very good work, detail work removing the graffiti. And then, of course, when you remove the graffiti, sometimes you expose the lighter colored rock below. So you've got to do a bit of camouflage. Here we did some camouflaging. Erin Pridgett from the Tennessee Valley Authority, the archaeologist there, she's using some natural earth pigments and earth oxides that is very much the same properties as the rock. The problem with those is you can do very good color matching, but sometimes they don't bond as well with the rock. So in time they come off. So with improved techniques and materials, Rahet and Steve at the White River Narrows, they're using a mineral silicate product called cane, and that is a pigment that has been developed by a German analytical chemist, I think in the 1800s, late 1800s, where the pigment has got silica base, but it's got micropores. So it bonds with the little sand silica particles in the tuff, which is glass rich. But then it also allows the water and stuff to go through the pores and stuff. And here also, unfortunately, because some of the incisions were so deep, and even if you color matched it perfectly, they still created a shadow. Ricky and Steve, I believe they were both in the class of 76 in Alamo, the high school there. Then you've got to remove it with a brush, and here in this case is Steve Dudrow. You all know him, and I guess, and he's here with a steel rotating hairbrush, evening the surface out so it doesn't create any shadows. And then Rahet and the rest of us came in, and we color matched it with the Kime pigment. And color matching can be difficult, and also doing it with the right textured thing that we found out at this place is not brushes, but more sea sponges, because of that texture. And certain colors really work very well. And once you find that color, you've got to kind of, treasure that, because, it's going to work for other sites in the area too, consuming that the rock type is similar and the environment. And sometimes you're really in for a conundrum like this place near San Diego, in a suburb north of San Diego, a Native American pictograph site where people came, some kids from the local high school, quite an affluent and educated community, that one would think that the kids would be the last to do that stuff, but they went and they partied there at night. All sorts of paraphernalia, some which I would not repeat here, among the dope pipes and stuff, and needles and things found there. And these kids were caught on camera. They were night vision camera. But the Indian people who were consulted, they didn't want to press charges. They thought that the kids should be given a warning, and but they didn't approve of the behavior of the kids. But anyway, some previous photographs that were taken of this, and de-stretch taken of this, acted as a guide to remove these things. And this is the removal, the after, before, after. And you could see that, to do this, I had to go with very fine blasting with a push thing around the pictographs. And also with permission, I added a bit of red pigment just to highlight some of the stuff. And because the black still throws you off if you stab the black solid. So I went where there was black left, I just went over the black. And this is what you get there. But this is an extreme case. And this is being monitored by the Department of Water and Sewage from San Diego, the city there. And they took care of some bigger graffiti in that area in consultation with the various indigenous Native American groups in that area. And also, with people from the community who use that park and so on. And I don't think there's been incidents again. Also, if these things are highly published, they discourage people from doing stuff. Now, visitor strategies and marketing strategies, they dovetail. Rock art very often occur in scenic areas like this Giant's Castle area, this national park in South Africa, where I've taken some tour groups before, and where people go, they do trout fishing, they do mountain hiking, they go and look at the vultures there. Some of them are rock climbers. So there's a wide range of opportunities to do recreation, or as I say, a wide opportunity spectrum, recreation opportunity spectrum. And you can see the little footpath going there up to, there's some pictographs in the shelter there. As you go closer, This is where the pictographs are. Very, very detailed San or Bushman rock paintings. And they put this boardwalk there, which is a good thing, but then you get a fire hazard. And I was myself involved where we put up a boardwalk and it burned down and some of the panels came off, and luckily nothing destroyed, but you don't want the integrity of a place being compromised. And also, yes, some of the stuff is a bit far away from the imagery, the Bushman stuff being very detailed. So I think, although I've got a lot of praise for what they've done here, I think if they do it again, they should bring some of the things closer. But the big plus is they've got docents like this, local people that they give the job, they train them. They could still speak the click language of the San people, although this is a Zulu person here, but she can do the different clicks. And they tell you, they interpret the site. And this is the best way, I think, if one can have a guide on the site, like at Writing on Stone in Canada, where they have Blackfoot and Crow Indians who go there and they're the guides. And they show people the traditional explanation of these things. Then you can get also gated stuff, a site that I worked on when I was still in South Africa, where there is this timeshare place close by. If they didn't have this gate here, this place would have been destroyed. There was graffiti done, but luckily it's against the ceiling with gypsum. People sometimes think it's a soot, but it's really the gypsum crystals that look black. And then you get the pictographs lower down, and they've got interpretive panels here and stuff. So yeah, it helped to have something done. This is Inca Mackay in Bolivia, an old Inca site, and that had a lot of dust problems and also a lot of graffiti. And I think they still paint there, but the Indians, they're scared of the museum personnel, so they don't want to say that they're painting. But I still think there's traditional stuff going on, and I think that's legitimate. I think there's a bit of a discommunication between the local campesinos, the peasant Indians, and the museum people. But anyway, that's not for me to say too much about it. But the dust problem was solved when the descendants of the Incas, the women, they master masons. They know any boulder that'll make good rock. So outside on the way there, they made these access routes and they put this walkway in here that reduces the amount of dust that being kicked up and settles on the petroglyphs and pictographs considerably. They also built this wall that keeps the llamas out, the llamas, because they came and they rubbed against the rock. And they've got this little visitor book here and also interpretive things with interpretive panels inside. So this is a very good example of where there was local input, the municipality helped, the Alcaldía, and the locals helped out, the archaeologists and various other agencies, tourist people. And as far as I know, the site is open to tourists, and it's a focal point, and nothing serious has happened there since because of applicable stuff that worked there. This thing might not work everywhere, but it definitely did work here. A big problem at sites is, it seems like a simple problem, but it's something that, I don't know, folks just don't want to listen to. It's where trails like this, footpaths, go too close to the rock, and wherever they got in reach of the rock, that's where people do the rock engravings and the graffiti where they spray. If it's a bit further away, and if you're going to have some sort of a psychological barrier in between, even if it's just a rope, like they've got a chaka, it works wonders. It keeps people away. But even there, sometimes you get the rope coming too close to the cliff face, and then people do graffiti. So basically, if you, by some means or other, can keep some distance between visitors and the rock face, the less graffiti there will be. And as I said, even a simple rope thing would do the trick. You don't want people too far away. You want them to see the pictographs. But then again, you don't want them to visit every little bit of pictograph site. And we tend to love things to death. This is Sanilac Rock up in Michigan, and the thumb part, as I say, of the Great Lakes of the state there in Michigan. And this rock was doing fine, but then they decided they're going to build this roof over it, open-sided arbor, if you like. And bats started nesting in this arbor, And as I said, you know, the excrement and stuff is highly, you know, acidic and stuff, and the weather's rock. And then also birds, swallows and swifts and stuff, made their mud nest in there, and they also you get the droppings on the rock. But also what is common in the eastern woodland is you can see the biological growth that comes out in the summer months. And that, you know, little rootlets and stuff releases weak acids and stuff that weathers the rock and causes damage. And then it's better there, just to daylight that stuff and have it out in the open. And because it survived thousands of years in some instances, and just make sure that people don't get on top of it. You can see they've got like a fence around it here. And then sometimes there's just not enough money or facilities or whatnot to have a place where rock art can be preserved. This is in southwestern Puerto Rico, where a Taino site that's about 1,000 years old, where the boulders were excavated, boulders next to a ball court where they used to play ball games. And because they were under compatible soil, they were really good condition when we excavated them. But there was a real problem or possibility that people would come, relic hunters, and take the stuff out and sell them in the market because they'll fetch quite big prices. And so we decided, like the Australopithecine, the old footprints, the Neanderthal, the Australopithecine footprints in East Africa, at places in Tanzania on the lava flows there, where Neanderthals walked over this old lava ash, and it became kind of fossilized or hardened through time, where they preserved that with geotextiles like this one, but putting soil in between. So we recommend the best preservation here is to bury it. So that is a alternative. Sometimes you've got to remove stuff. That is not an option we really want to do. But in South Africa, back in the early 80s, they were building a dam here. You can see it looks a bit like Nevada, like White River Narrows. There's a dam wall. The wall has since been done there. And you can see it's about under 40 meters of water here that this rock shelter would be. And rock paintings do not do well under rain, pictographs. When as soon as they get submerged, they do tend to weather away. So we had to get in a specialist, a professional quarry master, and to remove these things, and took it for safekeeping. Special building that was built next to the street of the National Museum in Bloemfontein, South Africa, where people now, if you go for lunch, you can see the boulder there with interpretive displays by just walking past it. So as you can see, there are different ways to do this. And Nevada, and I think even there, different sites, you know, depends where it is, different things, you know, need to be done. And then recommendations, as I said, it's usually ends up, you know, monitor, see what you've done works. And then there's always the thing of reassessment. And then in the end, and it's a pity that we've got to do it, I think, in addition to taking the trails, removing them away from the rock surface, it also helps to have the motion detection cameras, you know, place them in areas where people cannot see it, but tell people, notify them that there are cameras there, you are on video or whatever, candid camera, and people, I would say, all things being equal, people tend to act better if they think they're being watched. Even if there's sort of fake cameras installed, it'll help, I think, discourage graffiti from being reapplied. This is a Painted Bluff in northeastern Alabama where they installed cameras, and this visitor came here for thousands of years, and it's not going to harm the paintings, I guess, because they're a bit out of reach. But during the Mississippian times, people did do some paintings and incisions here, and you know, to make sure that these things survive for the next 800 years or whatever, you know, one's got to really just make sure that management measures and stuff are in place, and that fisher people coming here, whoever visit the site, they recognize that the things are there and that they should be not be interfered with. So a lot hinges on how a site is presented, how it's interpreted, and also, you know, how the significance of it is brought to bear, that these places are sacred to the original inhabitants of the land. Thank you. That's about it. I hope it didn't take too long, but that's the end of that. Shall I hit the screen share? Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think with the people that are here, a lot of them have seen the impact of visitation at their sites and understand, for example, one person's here and their site has like a fence around it, but no interpretation, right? So some interpretation would really go a long way at that particular site to discourage vandalism and give people better appreciation for what it is that they're looking at. And so if anybody has any questions, now is a good time to either put those in the chat or in the question and answer little box. So that was a very thorough, I think sometimes we just want to have a knee-jerk reaction. There's graffiti, it's time to get rid of it. But the bigger picture, I think, is, like you said, very important to understand the overall management of a site, of an area, because prevention, of course, is always the goal. So, all right, I'm not seeing any questions. So that was, oh, hang on. Does air pollution have a significant effect on pictographs?
Yeah, that's not been studied that well yet. I wonder with the biological growth that you find in a lot of the boulders here in Georgia and neighboring states, especially when it's rainy just after, you know, when the surface is wet, after, you know, downpours and stuff like that. Whether that's not exacerbated by, you know, more nitrogen and stuff in the air, particles. They've done some preliminary studies, not very rigorous, down in the Snake River in the Hells Canyon, and they reckon there is an expansion of lichen there because of more nitrogen being used in Idaho along the Snake River. It comes down the river, and the particles, you know, the biological growth, the algae and stuff that the fungi depend on, the lichen, you know, are more prolific. So I think in that case, pollution does affect it. And I can assume maybe too, knowing the chemistry of limestone, that in urban areas where there's more, you know, smoke in the air and stuff like that, where limestone will be accelerated. I mean, if you go to places like in Europe, like Oxford and the Notre Dame in Paris, you find that, you know, the limestone and a lot of the rock is, and also the Greek stuff is really increased because of air pollution. I don't know, you know, if you start going into caves and stuff like that further away from urban areas, that's kind of, as far as I know, understudied. What I do know, and I think this has been researched too, in Australian places like that, where these places, as a rule, rock surfaces with either pictographs or petroglyphs on them, they do like to be in the sun. So very often, that's why I think here in Georgia, you get more pictograph sites preserved that face south, due south. That could be a preservation thing rather than a selection thing. Likewise, in South Africa, a lot of these shelters face north, or they do not face west, because you get the baking thing of the sun really works with these things. There is a common fallacy that they say the sun fades the red. It does the reverse. The red gets accentuated. Sometimes the yellow gets converted to the goethite in the yellow, gets converted to hematite in the red, just because of high surface temperatures and sunlight. So sun is good. Alternating wet and dry, where you get the salts being mobilized and the size of the salt grains change, that is very bad for, you know, flaking and stuff like that. I think where sites are permanently dry or maybe even permanently humid, they do better than their cycles of wet, dry, wet, dry. Then you'll find that they won't last that long. And that could also be why here in the Southeast, a lot of the places are so badly weathered, because you don't get a specific season of rainfall. And out in Nevada, I mean, look at the long spells of drought there. Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, I can't answer that question, you know, thoroughly, but that's my take on weathering.
I think you did a good, good job explaining the effects of that and how we can see it and measure it. Does anybody else have any questions?
They have to monitor these things. You know, they say climate change does, you know, aggravate these things. For instance, the oldest stuff that they found now in Indonesia, then Sulawesi, I think they're in the tropical jungles, in some caves there, that, you know, interesting, from the word go, these things are iconographic. You know, it's recognizable people, recognizable animals. So it doesn't start from abstract going to representational. Sometimes even in Europe, the older stuff is representational and they're really nicely done. So it makes you wonder, you know, how does this work? But anyway, there they say that some of the stuff has really gone backwards because of climate change. But as everything else, one needs, you know, demonstration, physical proof, visual, you know, evidence that these things happened. And that's where I think archives for old photographs and stuff help. And that's why I think agencies tasked with looking after sites should try and keep archival records and try and photograph certain panels from a certain angle at a certain time of day. And so all these variables are controlled for, and then you can come back once a year and do the same, and do it, say, maybe start off doing it every 6 months, every year, every 3 years. We've done a monitoring station there on Miller Island in the Columbia River between Oregon and Washington State. And there we found a couple of changes. I mean, especially the positives change a lot, which make replication of the photo stuff, the camera position a bit more difficult. But we found minor changes there. But I think it's only once we've got to get a photographic record, archival thing, that we can start really talking about, you know, what does the pollutants do to these things and all of these other things. I know that wildfires do add to the surfaces. If you find that after a wildfire, there's a bit of rain and stuff, all that soot and charcoal can become fixed to the rock surface. That'll affect the dating. And you find that if you look at the rock surfaces, they all got kind of a matte texture to them. And I suspect that's got to do with some sort of a carbon in there. Because if you just take the inorganic pigment and you apply it, it's got far more shiny look to it. So through time, you get this matte look developing. So there's quite a lot of carbon in the atmosphere. And I think, especially with wildfires and stuff like that. But I don't think that has got deleterious effects. I don't think those things weather. They rather will mess with if you want to do any radiocarbon dating. But as I said, luckily, these micro layers do form through time. And if you've got enough time passing, your very first wildfire since the stuff was painted, that might have been trapped by the same carbon or by the same silica skin. So maybe you can get an accurate date. But to process those things is very intensive laboratory work, you know, cutting things out with lasers. And so sometimes the cost becomes prohibitive. And there might be other ways one can look at dating these things. And so dating can be done. And I think with improved technology, we're dating more and more stuff. But if you're not dating charcoal stuff, if you date things associated with the paintings, it becomes problematic, and there's a lot of assumptions involved. But it's good to recognize that there is a microstratigraphy, and that in time, the older it gets, the more significant it becomes. And there's always the chance of taking a little sample and then excavating it under the scanning electron microscope, with a microprobe or something like that. It is theoretically possible. And then one can check for things like pollution and so on. And there are events. I'll show you that cross section of the petroglyph right in the beginning, where the little gaps, the little cupules and the things where they engraved and pecked the rock surface out with the help of water, I think. But through time, that fills up, with micro dust and so on, little particles. And some of those particles are organic rich. And when they get sealed off by a layer of silica, you can go in there and date that. And Ron Dawn did that. And some of these things apparently change into what looks like, I forgot now what the name is, but it kind of starts looking like coal. And so some people accused him of doctoring the samples, but I think was just a result of natural processes, where you can date these things. So, where they change into what looks like a natural coal, anthracite. But so there's the potential, but there's always, all these assumptions that you've got to deal with. What is the nature of the organics that they've incorporated into, say, the red pigment? Because sometimes red pigment does have organics. I mean, the site that I showed you, paint rock there on the Tennessee, North Carolina line, the pictographs there that were red and yellow, where we sampled the red and got a lot of carbon from it. We're not sure what we've dated there. And we're also not sure of the layer that most of the stuff, well, it came from the bottom layer, but there were some other layer levels too. We never separated the layers. So we just got a number, and the number said it was 3,500 years old. Is that a result of the stuff that was underlying the pigment, or was it, an aggregate of all the numbers? So, the radioactive activity in the sample. So I think, the more one can be precise with the sampling, and the more I think the people who do the dating understand stratigraphy, that they don't just grind up a sample and date it, but, try and separate the layers. I think the more reliable the results will be. And they've dated some charcoal from caves, charcoal drawings, and came out more or less the same age. So it shows in the Southeast, for instance, that these things can be quite old. The stuff in Sulawesi that I mentioned, they dated those. Those were from, I think, electron spin resonance dating. And that is kind of and also optically stimulated luminescence. Those are different processes of dating. And some of it also assumptions built into it. And so some of those dates are still controversial, where they've done it with experimental techniques. But I think the more one get different dating techniques done in the same things that come out with more or less the same answers, obviously the more reliable they become. And so we'll see what the future tells us about all this old stuff.
And I think, as science progresses and new methodologies and stuff, and that's one of the reasons why archaeologists don't excavate a site completely, and other things, because we're always being more and more aware as technology changes that there'll be things that we thought impossible to do that become possible.
Yeah, so. And also I think when we do things like graffiti removal, we've got to be clear where we've done it, the areas, because if we use, say, something like charcoal in the graffiti, camouflage process. We should mention that, and people should be clear where that happened, and so that when any future things for dating should be in an area preferably high up where no cows could have urinated, or where nobody could have done stuff. So it's important to I think to keep as much record of what's been done at a site as possible, even just visitation, monitoring, and so on. Every little bit of evidence of record, I think, in the long run will help. And then often I find, as conservator and as archaeologist, one has to do a bit of detective work and see what's happened at a site to really fully understand what led to graffiti, and what could have, why it tailed off in certain area times, increased at other times. And as I showed, management does make a difference. I mean, I've got graphs. If you go to the RAN, the Rock Art Network website, there's an article that I've submitted there that you could see our dates and from graffiti, and the management approaches, and the context, whether it was run by an agency or whether it was on private property or whatever, and also the years, the zeitgeist, if you like, the population dynamics and stuff, shows you when it increased, when it decreased, and I think that also gives you an idea as to what happened when. Land use practices, overgrazing can wreak havoc to places like in Africa, where Mary Leakey, for instance, there near the Great Rift Valley, area was opened up for grazing, and she recorded some stuff before it was grazed, the area. And then the grazing in the 50s, just all the grass cover was removed, a lot of erosion, and the hydrology of the area changed, and water started entering the shelters, went over the drip line, went over the back wall of the shelter, and then removed some paintings. So you could see pre-leaky stuff and post-leaky recording stuff. So we call it the leaky event, or the post-leaky event, where the environment was degraded, and you find that a lot of the rock art suffered as a result. But there again, it's a toss-up. Do you interfere with the livelihoods of people, or do you prioritize the survival of the rock paintings? And I think there are compromise solutions that can be done, but sometimes those are difficult to communicate first, and then to implement and ensure that it happens. Of course, sometimes it's almost impossible in certain cases to make sure that people comply, because they've got to see a benefit from it as well. Are tourists coming here? Are they paying me to be the guide? Is it better that I have my goats and cattle graze there? What is the best decision? So, in other countries, other socio-economic setups, other cultural backgrounds, all these things add to variation as to how this can be approached. And I'm sure this is the case too in America, even on a micro scale. Do the sites near Las Vegas, are they then the same as the sites near Alamo, for instance? Sites with different histories, sites on different kinds of land. And I'm a bit worried for the one there next to the hot water springs there. What is it called again? The one between Alamo and White River Narrows, the little
Ash Springs or Crystal?
Ash Springs, yeah. Ash Springs, yeah. Mm-hmm. Just behind there, I mean, that rock is so friable that you have people walking by there. I think again something should be done there to keep people a bit away from that. But again, it's easier to recommend these things than actually applying it, then enforcing it, if you like, or whatever. And so these are the problems we're facing with. And also to close a place down is also seldom not the solution, because that local folks know where a place is and they'll go anyway. And sometimes out of spite, things will go south.
All right, I don't see any other questions, but everything you've talked about, the stuff that the site stewards are doing by going and monitoring their sites and taking baseline photographs, you are developing that history that he is talking about. So even if there are no human impacts and no arrests and none of that kind of hot action, there's, you know, the long-term benefits of having documented a site over time. And so I want to thank everybody who volunteers to do that, and everybody who joined us today to learn more about the management of these important places and see some highlights in Nevada, because that's hard work. I just want you all to know that, you know, scrubbing rocks and trying to camouflage, and that's hard, but the work that goes into the project prior to even, you know, putting your first cotton ball on the surface is a lot of work, a lot of science behind that, and preservation mindedness throughout the entire process. So thank you, Jannie, for everything that you do to make sure that these sites are taken care of, and the work that you contribute to the archaeological community, I think is very important. So I want to again thank everybody, and thanks for taking your Saturday mornings or early afternoons to join us today.
Yeah, I want to say thank you for inviting me and for helping me and facilitating. And I must say that among all the states, Nevada is one of the states in the forefront, maybe if not in the forefront of, you know, having site stewards doing, you know, preventative stuff, and, you know, keeping a lid on graffiti, you know, getting completely out of hand. Site stewardship is only taking off here in the Southeast now. And so really, Nevada is a place to look at. And, you know, I'll advise the Forest Service people here and so on to maybe consult with you guys, you know, about your programs and so on. But thank you very much. And